The wind carried a warning long before the first snow ever touched the ground. It slipped through the tall pines above the Bitterroot Valley with a sound that made old settlers stop their work for just a moment. They looked toward the mountains, then quietly returned to whatever was left unfinished. Everyone knew what was coming. Nobody knew how hard it would strike. Behind one lonely cabin, a woman disappeared into a small cave several times each day. She carried armfuls of split firewood, thick wool blankets, bundles of dried grass, flat stones from the creek. The neighbors watched from a distance. Some smiled. Some shook their heads. Nobody asked why. Weeks later, when the worst blizzard in years buried the valley, those same people stood outside her cabin, unable to understand one impossible thing. The chimney still breathed a thin bibbon of smoke. The fire inside had barely been touched. If you enjoy true frontier survival stories that reveal forgotten ways ordinary people stayed alive, stay with us until the end. You may discover an old idea that still makes sense today. Autumn settled gently across western Montana in 1882. Golden cottonwoods lined the river. Frost covered the grass before sunrise. Every morning felt colder than the one before. 35-year-old Hannah Mercer stepped outside before daylight wrapped around the valley. She pulled her worn wool coat tight and looked toward the hillside behind her cabin. The cave waited in silence. Most people barely noticed it. To Hannah, it looked like another chance. Her husband, Samuel, had started digging the shallow opening the year before. His plan had been simple: store potatoes through the winter and keep them from freezing. He never finished. A sickness settled into his lungs before spring arrived. By the time the snow melted, Hannah was standing alone beside a fresh grave with 3 children holding her hands. Since then, every choice belonged to her. Every mistake would belong to her as well. She turned toward the cave and picked up another armload of firewood. Her oldest son, Caleb, followed behind, carrying smaller pieces. Neither of them wasted words. Only the sound of boots pressing into frozen dirt broke the morning stillness. Inside the cave, the air felt different. Not warm, not cold. Steady. Hannah placed each log against the stone wall instead of throwing it into a pile. She left small spaces between every row so air could move around the wood. She stepped back, studying it for several seconds. Then she adjusted 2 logs that leaned too closely together. Caleb watched quietly. "Does it matter?" he finally asked. She rested one hand against the stone. "It always matters." That was enough for him. The cave slowly filled, not only with firewood. She carried in thick wool blankets that had belonged to her parents, old sheep fleece, bundles of dry cedar bark, small sacks of kindling. Even the iron kettle found a place near the back wall. Everything that hated moisture found a home inside the earth. The cabin itself remained almost unchanged. Anyone passing on horseback would have seen nothing unusual. That was exactly how Hannah wanted it. People noticed new buildings. They questioned strange ideas. Simple changes hidden behind familiar walls escaped attention. Several afternoons later, Hannah walked to the creek with a wooden sled. Instead of gathering more firewood, she searched for flat stones. Heavy ones, smooth ones, the kind that held the day's warmth long after sunset. Trip after trip, she dragged them uphill. Her youngest daughter counted every load until she lost track somewhere past 20. By evening, a narrow path of stone stretched between the cave and the back of the cabin. Hannah knelt beside it, brushing dirt from the cracks with stiff fingers. The stones stayed where she placed them. She smiled only for a second before standing again. There was still more work waiting. A neighbor named Walter Briggs rode past the following morning. His wagon overflowed with freshly split logs, stacked nearly as high as the wagon wheels. He slowed his horse when he noticed Hannah hanging thick wool across the cave entrance. The cloth moved gently in the wind. Walter scratched his beard. "You planning to keep the cave warm?" Hannah tied another corner to the wooden frame. "I'm planning to keep something else from getting cold." Walter laughed softly. "Seems like a lot of work for an old hole in the hill." She looked toward the mountains instead of answering. The clouds had changed. Dark lines stretched across the western sky, the kind Samuel used to notice before every early storm. Walter waited another moment. When no reply came, he tipped his hat and drove away. The sound of his wagon faded into the trees. That afternoon, Hannah packed a mixture of dry clay, fine ash, and straw into the cracks between the cabin floorboards. Her children copied every movement. Small hands pressed the mixture deep into every opening. Cold air would have to search much harder now. By sunset, little remained of the draft that once crept across the floor. The cabin felt different already. Not warmer, quieter. The wind no longer whispered beneath their feet. Days passed. The valley finished preparing for winter. Families stacked firewood against cabin walls. Barn doors were reinforced. Livestock disappeared into shelters. Life settled into its familiar rhythm. Only Hannah continued carrying supplies into the hillside. People stopped paying attention. They assumed she had simply found her own strange routine. That first week of December, the sky turned white before noon. Birdsong disappeared. The horses stood with their heads low. Even the river seemed to move more slowly beneath sheets of thin ice. Hannah stepped outside one final time. She rested her hand against the wool hanging across the cave entrance. Then she looked toward the northern ridge. Far beyond the trees, a wall of snow was swallowing the mountains. She quietly lifted the last bundle of dry cedar inside. Then she closed the wool curtain behind her. Before sunrise, the blizzard reached the valley. The first blast hit before daylight. Not with gentle snow, with wind that slammed against the cabin hard enough to rattle every log in the walls. Hannah opened her eyes before the sound finished rolling across the valley. She sat quietly for a moment. The cabin remained still. No cold air brushed across the floor. No loose boards creaked beneath the wind. Only the steady crackle of a small fire greeted the morning. She placed another dry log onto the coals. It caught almost immediately. No smoke filled the room. No damp hiss came from the wood. Caleb looked toward the window, where snow was already climbing halfway up the glass. "Is it starting?" Hannah nodded once. "It has already started." The children gathered around the table while she stirred a pot of oatmeal above the fire. Outside, the storm swallowed every familiar shape. The fence disappeared. The woodshed vanished. The trail leading toward the river simply ceased to exist beneath the driving snow. Even the pine trees looked like pale shadows, fighting to remain upright. The wind never rested. Hour after hour, it pushed against the cabin, with deep groans that sounded almost alive. By afternoon, the front door refused to open more than a few inches. Snow had packed tightly against it. Hannah didn't bother forcing it. She turned toward the back wall instead. Caleb watched as she lifted the small wooden hatch hidden beneath a woven rug. Cool air drifted gently upward. Nothing more. She carried an empty basket through the narrow passage into the cave. The children waited. Only a few moments later, she returned with 3 dry oak logs and another bundle of cedar kindling. Not a single snowflake entered the cabin. The fire welcomed the wood as though it had been drying beside the hearth all day. Emma smiled. "It smells different." Hannah looked toward the flames. "Dry wood always tells you." The hours stretched into evening. The storm only grew stronger. Snow struck the cabin walls with a steady hiss. Somewhere outside, a heavy branch snapped, then another. The mountain seemed to disappear completely behind moving white clouds. Nearly 3 miles away, Walter Briggs pushed open the door of his own cabin. Cold rushed inside immediately. His youngest son hurried to drag another armload of firewood through the snow. Every log wore a thin coat of ice. Walter split several pieces beside the hearth. Steam escaped before the wood finally caught fire. The flames struggled. His wife placed another blanket around the shoulders of their youngest daughter. Nobody spoke very much. Every few minutes, someone fed the fire again. Still, the room refused to grow comfortable. Walter glanced toward the shrinking woodpile. Only 1 day had passed. Already far more had disappeared than he expected. Back at Hannah's cabin, supper finished quietly. The children washed their bowls. Then Caleb unfolded a faded map Samuel had drawn months before he became ill. The 3 younger children leaned close while he pointed toward rivers, mountain trails, and hidden meadows their father once traveled. Hannah watched from her chair without interrupting. The fire remained low. Its steady glow reached every corner of the room. Nobody needed to crowd around it. Late that night, a sharp pounding shook the front door. Once, twice, then again. Hannah wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and forced the door open just enough to see outside. A young rider stumbled through the drifting snow, leading an exhausted mule. His beard was white with frost. His hands shook as he removed one glove. "My name's Thomas Reed." His words came slowly. "I lost the trail." Hannah looked toward the storm behind him. There was nothing beyond the blowing snow. No road, no trees, no stars, only white. She stepped aside. "Bring the mule around back." Thomas stared at her. "There isn't room." "There is tonight." Minutes later, the animal stood inside the cave, chewing dry hay Hannah had stored weeks earlier. Thomas looked around in disbelief. Stacks of firewood reached almost to the stone ceiling. Wool covered the entrance. The wind outside became little more than a distant rumble. He ran one hand across the dry logs. "They're warmer than the air outside." "They've stayed dry." She handed him another armful. "Take these inside." Thomas ducked through the narrow passage into the cabin. Warm light spilled across the tunnel stones. He stopped halfway. No icy draft rushed through behind him. No snow followed his boots. Only quiet. He looked back once before entering the room. By morning, the blizzard had buried nearly every cabin in the valley beneath towering drifts. Chimneys struggled against the fierce wind. Smoke curled downward instead of climbing into the sky. Families woke to frozen water buckets and shrinking woodpiles. Many wondered how long their supplies would last if the storm refused to leave. Inside Hannah's cabin, breakfast cooked slowly over the same gentle fire. Thomas sat silently at the table holding a warm tin cup between both hands. He had traveled across 3 territories. He had slept beneath wagons. He had crossed mountain passes in winter, yet he had never seen a cabin use so little firewood while staying this comfortable. He finally looked toward Hannah. "What made you build all this?" She rested another split log beside the fire. "My father once told me that winter never steals warmth all at once." She glanced toward the stone passage behind her. "It takes a little every hour." Thomas lowered his eyes toward the quiet flames. Outside, the wind screamed harder than ever. Then, somewhere beyond the buried valley, another sound rose above the storm. It wasn't the wind. It was a church bell. Someone was calling for help. The church bell rang again. One slow strike. Then another. The sound barely survived the wind, yet everyone in the cabin heard it. Thomas stood first. "That's Harper Crossing." Hannah looked toward the snow-covered window. "How far?" Almost 2 miles. She measured the silence after his answer. 2 miles on a clear day meant little. 2 miles through this storm could swallow a man forever. Caleb quietly folded the old map. Someone's out there. Hannah walked to the back passage instead of the front door. She filled 2 canvas sacks with dry oak logs, then another with cedar bark and kindling. Thomas watched her. You can't carry enough wood to save everyone. She tightened the leather straps. I'm not carrying enough for everyone. She picked up an iron kettle. I'm carrying enough to start. Thomas nodded once. No more words were needed. The mule waited inside the cave. Its coat was dry. Its breath drifted gently into the cool air. Hannah fastened the supplies across the saddle, while Caleb wrapped another wool blanket around the animal's neck. Before leaving, Hannah knelt beside the children. If we're late, Emma quickly shook her head. You'll come home. Hannah rested one hand against her daughter's cheek. Then she stood. The wool curtain lifted. A wall of white exploded into the cave entrance. Within seconds, the curtain dropped behind them again. The storm swallowed every sound except the wind. Snow reached the mule's chest in places. Thomas walked ahead, holding a long rope tied to the saddle. Each step disappeared almost immediately behind them. The valley no longer looked familiar. Fences had vanished. Creeks had become smooth white fields. Even the tallest trees appeared only when the wind briefly loosened its grip. Hannah never looked far ahead. She watched the ground. She remembered where the frozen creek bent toward Harper Crossing. She remembered where large stones rested beneath the snow. Old memories became the only trail left. After nearly an hour, Thomas suddenly stopped. A wagon wheel stuck out of the drift. Only the top edge remained visible. Together they dug through packed snow with their hands. An older man sat against the wagon seat wrapped in blankets. His lips moved, but no sound came. Beside him, a young girl clutched a wooden doll beneath her coat. The horse stood perfectly still, buried almost to its shoulders. Hannah untied one sack of dry wood. Thomas gathered broken fence rails sticking above the snow. Within minutes, a small fire pushed back the freezing air beneath the shelter of the overturned wagon. The cedar bark caught quickly. The dry oak followed without struggle. Warm steam rose from the old man's gloves. His hand slowly began to move again. The little girl stared into the flames without blinking. She held her doll a little closer. Thomas looked toward Hannah. We'll never reach Harper Crossing before dark. Hannah glanced toward the sky. There was no sun left to judge, only endless white. We don't have to. She turned toward the wagon. The storm brought them here. The old man finally found his voice. My son! He pointed weakly toward the north. He went for help. Hannah followed the direction with her eyes. Nothing moved. Nothing answered. Only drifting snow crossed the empty valley. Thomas lowered his head. If he kept walking, he never finished. Hannah reached into another canvas bag. She handed the girl a thick piece of bread wrapped in cloth. The child accepted it with both hands. Her fingers barely bent around it. Hours slipped by. The fire stayed alive because every log Hannah carried had remained dry inside the cave. Thomas noticed how slowly they burned. No smoke rolled into their faces. No wet crackling filled the air. Each piece gave steady heat before settling into bright coals. You planned for this. Hannah watched another log settle across the fire. I planned for winter. A faint shout drifted through the wind. Thomas stood immediately. Again. The sound came closer this time. Several dark figures slowly appeared through the blowing snow. 3 men, 2 horses, 1 sled. The missing son had found help from a ranch farther north. Relief spread across every face without anyone saying a word. The old man squeezed Hannah's hand before climbing carefully onto the rescue sled. The little girl looked back once. She lifted her wooden doll in a quiet wave. Then they disappeared into the storm. Thomas stared after them. "You just gave away nearly half your firewood." Hannah secured the empty canvas sacks. "I still have enough." "For yourself." She shook her head. "For whoever reaches my door next." Thomas looked toward her with new understanding. The journey home felt even longer. Snow climbed higher against the mule. Darkness settled over the valley long before evening should have arrived. When the cabin finally appeared through the storm, its chimney still carried a thin stream of smoke into the freezing air. The children opened the hidden tunnel before Hannah even reached the back entrance. Warm light spilled across the stone passage. The mule stepped inside without hesitation. Thomas paused before following. He looked once more toward the buried valley. Every other cabin had disappeared beneath snow and darkness. Only one small ribbon of smoke remained easy to find. He quietly realized why. It wasn't because Hannah had built a better fire. It was because she had spent weeks protecting every bit of warmth before winter ever asked for it. The storm still had one more night left, and before morning, someone else would come searching for that same thin line of smoke. Morning arrived without sunlight. The storm had finally grown quiet. Snow covered the Bitterroot Valley so deeply that fences, wagons, and even small sheds had almost disappeared beneath smooth white hills. For the first time in 4 days, Hannah opened the front door. It moved only after Caleb and Thomas pushed together from inside. A wall of packed snow broke apart and spilled into the yard. Fresh air rushed across their faces. The world looked unfamiliar. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Only the slow drip of melting ice from the cabin roof broke the stillness. Thomas stepped outside first. He turned slowly, studying the little cabin from every angle. The chimney still released a thin stream of smoke. The woodpile outside remained almost untouched. He looked toward the hidden cave behind the cabin. Now he finally understood why. Before noon, the first visitors arrived. Walter Briggs came through the snow with 2 neighbors walking behind him. Their boots dragged heavily after days of digging paths between cabins. Walter stopped several feet from Hannah. He looked at the chimney, then at the nearly full wood stack inside the cave. Finally, he looked at Hannah herself. "I thought you'd be asking us for help." Hannah brushed snow from the cave entrance. "I had what we needed." Walter slowly walked inside the tunnel. His rough hands rested against the stone walls. The air felt calm. No sharp blast of winter reached him there. He looked at the rows of dry firewood. Every piece remained clean. Every piece was ready to burn. He stood quietly for several moments before speaking. "I laughed when I saw you hanging wool here." Hannah smiled gently. "I remember." Walter lowered his eyes. "I was wrong." She simply handed him one dry log. He turned it over in both hands. The difference spoke for itself. By afternoon, more families arrived. Some came carrying empty sleds. Others brought notebooks made from folded paper. A few only wanted to see the cave with their own eyes. Nobody laughed now. Instead, they asked simple questions. How deep is the passage? How much wool did you use? Why stone instead of wood? Hannah answered each one patiently. She never hurried. She never claimed to know everything. She simply explained what had worked inside her own little cabin. Thomas helped measure the tunnel. Caleb showed the children how the wood had been stacked with small spaces between each row. Emma demonstrated how the wool curtain closed gently after someone walked through. Even the youngest child proudly pointed toward the floor, where ash and clay filled the cracks. Every small detail mattered. Late that afternoon, Ruth Collins arrived with a basket of fresh bread. She had doubted Hannah from the beginning. Now she stood inside the cave without speaking. She reached out and touched the thick wool hanging across the entrance. Then she looked toward the stone passage leading into the cabin. "I never imagined something this simple." Hannah accepted the bread. Neither did most people. Ruth smiled softly. "My boys will start building one tomorrow." Over the following weeks, the valley slowly returned to life. Roads reopened. Livestock wandered back into snowy fields. Smoke once again rose from every homestead. But something had changed. Where people once stacked firewood against outside walls, many now searched for dry places beneath hillsides and root cellars. Several cabins added short covered passages behind their kitchens. Others sealed the cracks beneath their floors before the next snowfall arrived. Nobody copied Hannah's work exactly. Each family adjusted it to their own land. Yet the idea spread from one homestead to another until it became as common as sharpening an axe before winter. Years passed. Children who had watched Hannah carry stones to the cave became parents themselves. They taught their own sons and daughters to protect dry firewood before the first frost. They remembered the hidden passage, the wool curtain, the quiet little cave behind one ordinary cabin. Few people remembered the exact year. Fewer remembered the size of the storm. But they remembered the woman who prepared before everyone else believed they needed to. One cold evening, many winters later, Thomas returned to the valley. His hair had turned gray around the edges. His boots carried dust from places far beyond Montana. He stopped beside Hannah's cabin. The cave remained there. The stone passage still connected it to the house. Children's laughter drifted through the open doorway. Thomas stood quietly, watching smoke rise into the evening sky. Not because the cabin was larger, not because the fire burned brighter, because someone had understood that winter could be challenged long before it arrived. He tipped his hat toward the little hillside. Then he climbed back onto his horse. The narrow trail carried him slowly between snow-covered pines until both rider and horse disappeared into the fading light. Behind him, the small cabin remained exactly where it had always stood, its chimney sending one quiet line of smoke into another Montana winter. If you enjoyed this frontier survival story, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share in the comments where you're watching from and what winter memory has stayed with you the longest.